Natale.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak in support of the National Integrity Commissioner Bill. Now, this is the third straight time that the Parliament has had the opportunity to consider this bill. I'm the third leader of the Australian Greens to put this bill before the Australian Parliament. I do so at a time when there is a tremendous public appetite for reform in the area of politicians' entitlements, but an appetite around the issue of corruption more generally. What this bill does is it establishes a National Integrity Commission, which is effectively a corruption and standards watchdog. The National Integrity Commission would have three arms. It has the National Integrity Commissioner, which would be responsible for the investigation and prevention of misconduct and corruption in all Commonwealth departments, agencies and federal parliamentarians and their staff. It would, as a second arm, have a watchdog that ensures that law enforcement has some independent oversight. So it would be responsible for the investigation and prevention of corruption in the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Crime Commission. And finally, and perhaps most germane to the issue of the day, it would consist also of an independent parliamentary advisor. That is, an advisor that would provide independent advice to ministers and parliamentarians on conduct, on ethical matters and, of course, on the appropriate use of their parliamentary entitlements. So this is a bill that seeks to expose corruption, but not just corrupt behaviour, but also behaviour that is completely inconsistent with the standards demanded of us by the Australian community. It wouldn't just police and expose that corruption, but it would play a very important preventative role as well. It both through the functions of advising MPs around the use of their entitlements and other related issues, but also in the ability to be able to investigate cases where corrupt conduct is foreseeable, and they would be able to provide advice and make much more proactive findings in addressing issues of corruption. So let's go to the issue of the independent parliamentary advisor. It's effectively an independent umpire that has the ability to be able to make judgments around the appropriate use of parliamentary entitlements. Now, this is a very important issue. It's an issue that obviously has come to public attention in recent weeks because of the level of abuse that exists around the issue of parliamentary entitlements. And people have never held politicians in lower esteem than they do at the current time, and it is in part because of some people in this place who seek to use those entitlements that allow us to do our job in a way that furthers their own personal self-interest. We've seen people claim family holidays as work expenses. We've seen people travel to weddings, to rock concerts and so on, and claim these as professional business expenses. We, of course, had the spectacle of the former Speaker of the House travelling by helicopter to do a trip that I do very regularly by car in a helicopter. And one has to wonder about how someone can come to a view that that gross excess is acceptable. Having done that trip regularly myself, she was also guilty of gross stupidity, because I suspect she would have got there quicker had she have driven rather than take the time to board a publicly funded helicopter. But the issue here is this, is that collectively hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars are being spent in areas that are simply not consistent with what we would all accept is good practice. And at a time when the Treasurer tells us that the age of entitlement is over, that we're facing a budget emergency, that we need to tighten our belts, what message does it send to the Australian community that we here, as opinion leaders, are prepared to engage in those gross excesses? It is hypocrisy of the greatest order, and it is why we do need to have an independent umpire make judgments on whether something is a legitimate business expense. Now, one of the areas I think that most of us will agree on is that there is a large area of grey when it comes to deciding what is a work expense and what should classify as something that is a claimable or reimbursable expense. For example, as a portfolio holder in the area of health, and as somebody who until recently was not a government minister, being asked to open a conference interstate, was that something to which I was entitled to claim as a professional business expense? Areas of grey in that. What if the trip included a meeting with a candidate for office from my political party? What proportion of the trip should be claimable? All of those areas that I think we need some advice on. And that's why an independent umpire would take the discretion out of the hands of politicians, many of whom have shown they can't be trusted, but would also put some clarity around some areas where there are legitimate debates about whether they should be classed as reimbursable expenses. So here we have an opportunity to do something in a way that ensures that we actually get some movement on this issue. And instead what we saw from the government was a classic political response, right out of the Yes Minister handbook. When you're in trouble, when there's a lot of public pressure on you as a government and you don't want to act, what do? Call for a review or an inquiry. That's what you do. You call for a review or an inquiry. And so now we've got the fifth review in a short space of time into parliamentary entitlements. We had the Belcher review, where we had recommendations, many of which remain still not acted upon. We had the Williams review, and we've had 2 Auditor-General reports. So, of course, in an effort to try and shift this from the front pages of the newspapers, we ensure that there is yet another review into parliamentary entitlements. I note that the panel composition does not include a member of or former member of any of the crossbenchers. There are a number of Green MPs, Democrat MPs and indeed other crossbenchers who are no longer in this place who would have been able to make a valuable contribution to this issue. Instead, we see both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party represented on this panel, and of course what we will see is weak recommendations, but a ploy to ensure that we don't talk about it until the review hands down its findings, and hopefully by that time the issue will have left public consciousness. It's classic distraction tactics, and I implore the Prime Minister that if he is going to go ahead with this review, that there is representation from both from the crossbenchers, including from the Greens. And the issue of the Office of Independent Parliamentary Advisor would ensure that there would be a legally binding code of conduct for all MPs to sign up to. That would ensure that we're very clear about what's expected of us, and then we would ensure that that independent umpire would offer impartial and consistent advice to MPs on what they can and can't claim. It is my view that the issue of parliamentary entitlements, of course, goes to something much, much deeper. I think it goes to a complete disengagement and disillusionment with the current political discourse in this place. It reflects an anger at the level of political debate that we have here, at the very negative and adversarial partisan politics that have come to dominate the current parliament. And I think we've got a unique opportunity to go some way to address that, to ensure that the work that we do in this place is made easier, not harder, because the community understand that we are acting in their interests and not in our own interests. There are other things that we should do that aren't, of course, the substance of this bill. the method for the election of the parliamentary speaker and indeed the President of the Senate. I think that needs to be reviewed. We need to make some significant changes to our standing orders, including the way we engage in question time, and there are much broader issues around things like political donation. Now let me come to the other arms of this bill, because this bill is not simply about workplace expenses, as important as that issue is, but it's about the issue of corruption more generally. And we have in every state in Australia some version of an anti-corruption commission. And yet here in the federal parliament we have nothing. There's a view that somehow we are immune to the sorts of corruption scandals that have engulfed other state governments. And let me run through some of those, because corruption at a state level has been clearly identified, established, and individuals have been prosecuted. Only recently in South Australia we saw the chief executive of a state government agency charged with 2 accounts of abuse in public office. In Victoria, my home state, we've got the likes of an education department, a financial manager who funnelled $2.5 million from schools into his pocket and the pockets of his relatives and other departmental officials. Some of the money was spent on overseas trips, on lavish parties and so on. Last month, IBAC, that is Victoria's version of the Anti-Corruption Commission, charged 9 people, including 2 mid-level public servants, for allegedly funnelling $25 million from Victoria's Public Transport Department into a range of family-linked businesses over 7 years. How was that money spent? Well, on real estate, luxury goods, jet skis and a grand piano. And we now have IBAC turning its attention to revelations of a fraud worth up to $1 million involving the botched school computer system. And there are now growing calls in Victoria for the powers of IBAC to be ramped up because of what we've seen exposed. Now, I'm not going to go into the now infamous revelations that have occurred in New South Wales around ICAC, their Anti-Corruption Commission, but it's fair to say that the corrupt activity engaged in by former state Labor ministers Eddie Obeid and Ian McDonald, along with the exposure of a number of illegal donations from property developers to a number of state Liberal MPs, that those actions are now legendary. But the question is this: does anyone think that that behaviour is limited to state parliaments, that it does not cross state boundaries, that somehow the Australian parliament is immune? And yet here we are, with the federal parliament, the only jurisdiction left unchecked against the very real threat of internal corruption and maladministration across the public service and indeed our law enforcement agencies. It's very, very clear, absolutely clear, that given the widespread and established corruption charges that have been dealt with at a state level, that we need, as a matter of urgency, a federal anti-corruption watchdog. We had the counsel assisting the New South Wales ICAC, Geoffrey Watson QC, and I'll quote him. He says, "I've seen things that show that federal politicians are not immune from temptation." And of course, information that was gathered by the New South Wales corruption body left him, and I quote, "convinced of the need for a federal ICAC." Unquote. We have Transparency International, that organisation charged with exposing corruption wherever it occurs. We had Transparency International Director Neville Tiffin state, and again I quote, "It's almost unbelievable that the Commonwealth does not have an ICAC. Detractors say there's no need for a federal ICAC because there's no evidence that corruption exists at the federal level. This is a nonsense. They must believe behaviour changes as you board a plane for Canberra. Without a federal ICAC, we simply do not know the level of corruption that exists." Unquote. I mean, if you don't look for it, you won't find it. And if anything that the recent scandal around parliamentary entitlements shows us is that there is behaviour that is unacceptable and that in some cases will border on the corrupt if we don't have the structures in place to expose it. If you don't look, you won't find it. And Transparency International has also criticised Australian law for its low and ineffective penalties that punish corrupt behaviour. A report in 2009 highlights that Australia made little or no effort to enforce the OECD Convention on combating the bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions. We have a very, very poor record when it comes to stamping out corruption in all of its guises. And just as recently as late last year, Transparency International released a report which said that Australia had dropped for the second consecutive year in its annual rankings, the Corruption Perceptions Index, now slipping outside of the top 10 nations. Now, of course, when it comes to comparing ourselves to some low-income countries, of course we do better. But is that where we want to set the benchmark? Of course we don't. We are slipping now outside of the top 10 nations when it comes to transparency. And let's be clear, corruption is a cancer. It impacts all levels of community life, and it's a drag on business. We need to ensure that we stamp it out wherever it occurs and whatever guises it occurs in. So we are slipping in global standing. We are slipping in the standards that the Australian people expect from us as parliamentarians. And the recent scandal surrounding parliamentary entitlements is symptomatic of something much broader. And who is to say that if we were to look a little deeper, we wouldn't find not just abuses of parliamentary entitlements, but broad and wide-ranging corruption within all levels of our parliamentary agencies. And that's why we so desperately need this bill to pass. Of course, the review into the entitlements is a small step forward, the concern, of course, being that it's simply to create the illusion of action when both sides of politics are committed to inaction. But it's nowhere near enough. We need much more. We need a federal anti-corruption watchdog. We need an independent body that has the powers to hold all Commonwealth agencies, all departments, all federal parliamentarians and their staff to high standards of transparency. We can and should do better. We need to ensure that we have powers to provide oversight to our law enforcement agencies to prevent corruption within the AFP and within the Australian Crime Commission. We need an independent umpire to provide advice to ministers and parliamentarians on conduct and ethics and on the appropriate use of parliamentary entitlements. We can have these reforms right now. We don't have to wait until the 5th review into parliamentary entitlements is conducted. We could act now. We could, if we had a government and an opposition who were prepared to support this bill, show that we are committed to ending corruption in all of its forms and to ensuring that parliamentary expenses are used for what they're intended, that is, parliamentary